Mrs. Pelosi, you asked what qualifies me to sit in this chair. Let me tell you what qualifies me. Speaker Mike Johnson's voice was calm, almost gentle, but his words cut through the House chamber like a blade. I'm qualified because I've never used my position to enrich myself. I've never traded stocks before major legislation I helped write. I've never gone from $2 million to $278 million on a congressional salary. Nancy Pelosi sat frozen at the witness table, her famous composure cracking for the first time anyone could remember. The confident smirk she had worn for the past 90 minutes was gone. In its place was something the House hadn't seen before: uncertainty. My father was a firefighter, Johnson continued. He was critically burned and permanently disabled in the line of duty when I was 12 years old. I watched him struggle. I watched my family struggle. I worked my way through college and law school. I've never had a $24,000 freezer full of gourmet ice cream. He held up a document. Your net worth when you entered Congress in '87, approximately $271 million. Your net worth today, $278 million. That's a 10,000% increase on a salary that's never exceeded $223,000 a year. Johnson looked directly at her. You asked about my experience. Here's my experience. I know the difference between public service and self-service. I know that when you serve the people, you shouldn't end up 100 times richer than when you started. He set down the document. You've been in this chamber for 37 years, Mrs. Pelosi, and in those 37 years you've become one of the wealthiest members of Congress, while your district has become one of the most troubled cities in America. Homeless encampments, open-air drug markets, streets covered in needles and human waste. You got richer? San Francisco got worse. That's your experience. That's your legacy. And that's why the American people decided they wanted something different. He looked around the chamber. That's why I'm sitting here. And that's why you're not. 2 hours earlier, Nancy Pelosi had walked into the House chamber like a queen, returning to reclaim her throne. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who had dominated this room for decades. Her entourage followed loyal staffers, friendly media figures, Democratic colleagues who still treated her like royalty. They formed a protective constellation around her, a reminder that even out of the Speaker's chair, Nancy Pelosi remained the most powerful figure in Democratic politics. The occasion was a special session on congressional ethics, specifically the debate over the Pelosi Act, a bill that would ban members of Congress and their spouses from trading individual stocks. The bill's name was a not-so-subtle dig at Pelosi, whose family's stock trading had become a national controversy. Senator Josh Hawley had originally named it the Preventing Elected Leaders from Owning Securities and Investments Act, with the acronym spelling out exactly who it was targeting. Pelosi had been invited to share her perspective on the legislation. Officially, it was a courtesy extended to a senior member of the House. Unofficially, everyone knew what it really was: an opportunity for Pelosi to defend herself against years of accusations. But Nancy Pelosi had no intention of playing defense. As she took her seat at the witness table, she surveyed the chamber with barely concealed contempt. Her eyes lingered on the Speaker's chair, her chair, the seat she had occupied for 8 years across 2 different tenures. The seat now occupied by Mike Johnson, a man she considered utterly beneath her. Mike Johnson, a backbencher from Louisiana, who had been in Congress for barely 6 years before somehow stumbling into the speakership. A religious conservative who told reporters to pick up a Bible if they wanted to understand his worldview. A man who had never chaired a committee, never passed major legislation, never done anything of significance before the chaos of Republican infighting deposited him in the most powerful position in the House. Pelosi had been building coalitions and passing landmark legislation while Mike Johnson was still in law school. She had stared down a president's survived impeachment battles and shaped the direction of American politics for a generation. And now this amateur sat in her chair presiding over a hearing designed to humiliate her. Not today, she thought. Today I remind everyone who really runs this house. Her plan was simple. She would turn the tables. Instead of defending her stock trades, she would attack Johnson's fitness for office. She would remind the chamber and the national audience watching that the man holding the gavel had no business being there. She would be gracious on the surface and devastating underneath the way she had destroyed countless opponents over 4 decades. What Pelosi didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Mike Johnson had been preparing for this moment for months. Since the day the Pelosi Act was introduced, Johnson's staff had been quietly compiling documentation. They had obtained financial disclosures going back to 1987. They had analyzed trading patterns, cross-referenced them with legislative calendars, and documented every suspiciously timed transaction. They had pulled footage from January 6th that the previous Select Committee had never released. They had gathered data on San Francisco's decline, the homeless numbers, the crime statistics, the drug overdose deaths. Johnson had 6 folders arranged on his desk, each one containing enough evidence to end a political career. He had hoped he wouldn't need them. He had hoped Pelosi would simply testify, defend her record, and move on. But he had suspected she wouldn't be able to resist attacking him. The leaks from Democratic staffers had been clear Pelosi was planning to use this hearing to put the new speaker in his place. She was going to lecture him about experience, mock his religious beliefs, and remind everyone that he was a temporary placeholder while the adults waited to reclaim power. Johnson had decided to let her try. Let her attack, he had told his chief of staff the night before. Let her say everything she wants to say. Don't interrupt. Don't object. Just let her talk. Sir, she's going to eviscerate you on national television. Johnson had smiled. No, she's going to give me permission to respond. And when I respond, I'm going to use 37 years of her own record against her. He had opened the first folder. She's going to attack my inexperience, but her experience is a record of self-enrichment while her district collapsed. She's going to attack my religion, but I've never used my faith to make myself rich. She's going to attack my role on January 6th, but there's video of her admitting she was responsible for the security failures. She's going to attack my competence, but her competence produced $278 million in personal wealth and a city covered in human feces. Johnson had closed the folder. Everything she's going to accuse me of, she's guilty of in far worse measure. She just doesn't know I have the documentation. Now, as Pelosi settled into her seat and prepared to testify, Johnson arranged his folders in precise order. Stock trading. January 6th. San Francisco. COVID hypocrisy. The pattern. He knew exactly what she was going to say, and he knew exactly how he was going to respond. Nancy Pelosi began her testimony with the expected pleasantries, thanking the chairman, acknowledging the importance of the topic, expressing her commitment to ethical governance. But within minutes, the pleasantries gave way to something sharper. I appreciate the opportunity to address this committee on the question of congressional stock trading, she said. It's an important issue that deserves serious consideration. Unfortunately, what we've seen from this legislation is not serious consideration. It's political theater. She glanced toward the speaker's chair. The so-called Pelosi Act is named after me for a reason. Not because I've done anything wrong, I haven't, but because certain members of this body believe that attacking me personally is a substitute for actual governance. Pelosi folded her hands on the table. I've been in public service for 37 years. I've served as Speaker of this House for 8 of those years, longer than anyone since Sam Rayburn. I've passed the Affordable Care Act, the Dodd-Frank financial reforms, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. I've built coalitions negotiated with presidents of both parties and delivered results for the American people. Her voice hardened. And now I'm expected to sit here and be lectured about ethics by people who've accomplished nothing, by people who've been in Congress for a fraction of my tenure and have nothing to show for it, by people who think that naming a bill after me constitutes legislative achievement. She turned to look directly at Speaker Johnson. Mr. Speaker, with respect, I was passing landmark legislation while you were still in law school. I was negotiating with world leaders while you were arguing cases in Baton Rouge. I've forgotten more about how this institution works than you've had time to learn. Johnson made a note on his legal pad, but said nothing. Encouraged by his silence, Pelosi pressed on. Let's be honest about what's happening here. This isn't about ethics. This is about politics. This is about a Republican Party that can't govern, can't pass legislation, can't even keep its own speaker in office without constant drama and infighting. She gestured around the chamber. You want to talk about ethics. Let's talk about January 6th. Let's talk about members of this body who voted to overturn a democratic election. Let's talk about people who signed onto lawsuits to throw out millions of legitimate votes. Let's talk about the people in this chamber who encouraged an insurrection and then walked away without consequences. Pelosi's voice rose. The current speaker, the man holding that gavel right now, was one of them. He organized the legal effort to overturn the election. He signed the amicus brief in the Texas lawsuit. He voted against certifying the results. And now he sits in judgment of me. She shook her head in theatrical disbelief. Mr. Speaker, you told reporters that if they want to understand your worldview, they should pick up a Bible. That's not governance. That's not leadership. That's theocracy. America is not a Christian nation in the sense you mean it. It's a nation of laws of separation of church and state, of pluralism and diversity. Johnson continued to take notes. His expression remained neutral. You've been in Congress for 8 years. Pelosi continued, her confidence growing with each unanswered attack. In those 8 years, what have you accomplished? What legislation bears your name? What coalitions have you built? What problems have you solved? She answered her own question. Nothing. You've accomplished nothing. You've spent your time in Congress fighting culture wars, defending the indefensible, and waiting for someone to hand you power you never earned. Pelosi leaned forward. And now you're Speaker. Not because your colleagues respect you, not because you've demonstrated leadership, but because your party is so fractured, so dysfunctional, that you were the only person nobody actively hated. You're not a leader. You're a compromise. You're what happens when a party can't agree on anything else. She sat back satisfied with her performance. So, before this committee lectures me about stock trading, which I remind you is entirely legal, and which my husband conducts independently without any input from me, perhaps we should discuss whether the people running this investigation have any standing to judge anyone. Pelosi folded her arms. I've dedicated my life to public service. I've sacrificed, I've fought, I've delivered results, and I won't be lectured by amateurs who think that holding a gavel makes them qualified to lead. She looked directly at Johnson one more time. That's my testimony. I'm happy to answer questions from anyone who has the standing to ask them. The chamber was silent. Democratic members were nodding approvingly. A few even applauded softly. This was the Nancy Pelosi they knew, sharp, fearless, dominant. She had walked into an ambush and turned it into a counterattack. At the Speaker's chair, Mike Johnson set down his pen. "Are you finished, Mrs. Pelosi?" His voice was calm, almost gentle. Pelosi raised an eyebrow. "I believe I've made my points." "You have, very thoroughly." Johnson stood and walked to the front of the dais. "And I appreciate your candor. It makes what I'm about to do much easier." Something in his tone made Pelosi's confident expression flicker. "You've raised questions about my experience, my qualifications, my fitness for this office. You've questioned my faith, my role in the events of January 6th, and my legislative accomplishments. You've suggested that I have no standing to participate in this hearing." Johnson picked up the first folder. "So let's talk about standing. Let's talk about qualifications. Let's talk about what 37 years in Congress actually looks like." He opened the folder. "Let's start with your stock portfolio, since we're here to discuss the bill that bears your name." Johnson spread documents across his podium with methodical precision. "When you entered Congress in 1987, Mrs. Pelosi, you and your husband reported a net worth of approximately $2 million. Comfortable, certainly, wealthy by any normal standard, but not extraordinary for someone married to a successful businessman." He held up a chart. "Today, your estimated net worth is $200 million. $278 million. That's not a typo. That's not an exaggeration. That's the number reported by financial analysts who track congressional wealth." Johnson let the number sink in. "Let's do some math. Your congressional salary over 37 years has ranged from $89,500 when you started to $223,500 as Speaker. Even if we assume you earned the maximum salary every single year, which you didn't, and saved every penny, which you couldn't, because you have to pay taxes and living expenses, you could have saved approximately $8 million over your entire career." He looked at Pelosi. "You didn't save $8 million. You accumulated $275 million more than that. Where did the money come from?" Pelosi's voice was tight. "My husband is a successful venture capitalist." "Your husband is an excellent investor," Johnson agreed. "Remarkably excellent. Suspiciously excellent. In fact, according to financial analysts, your family's stock portfolio has outperformed virtually every hedge fund in America." He pulled out more documents. "In 2024, your portfolio returned 71%. 71% in a single year. For comparison, Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway returned about 20%. The S&P 500 returned about 25%. Your family beat the greatest investor in history by more than 50 percentage points." Johnson held up a list of trades. "Let's look at some specific transactions." In 2008, Visa was preparing for its initial public offering. This was one of the most anticipated IPOs in years. Ordinary investors couldn't get access to IPO shares. They're reserved for institutional investors, and apparently the families of powerful politicians. Your husband was offered and purchased 5,000 shares of Visa at $44 per share. 2 days later, those shares were worth $64 each. Your family made approximately $100,000 in 48 hours. He looked up. "At the time, you were Speaker of the House. There was legislation pending that would have regulated credit card companies' legislation that Visa strongly opposed. That legislation never came to the floor for a vote." Pelosi attempted to respond. "That legislation failed for many reasons. I'm not done, Mrs. Pelosi." Johnson pulled out another document. July 2022. The CHIPS Act was about to come before Congress. This was legislation that would provide $52 billion in subsidies to semiconductor companies. It would directly benefit companies like NVIDIA. And shortly before the vote, your husband exercised call options to purchase 20,000 shares of NVIDIA at $100 per share. When the CHIPS Act passed and semiconductor stocks surged, those shares became worth millions. Johnson held up the trading record. Your husband bought semiconductor stocks right before Congress voted to give semiconductor companies $52 billion. You were one of the most powerful supporters of that legislation. And you expect us to believe there was no connection. My husband makes his own investment decisions. In December 2022, your husband sold 30,000 shares of Google stock. 1 month later, Google was sued by the Justice Department for antitrust violations. The stock dropped. Your husband sold at the top right before bad news hit. Johnson spread more documents across his podium. November 2023. Your husband purchased 50 call options in NVIDIA with a $120 strike price. Over the next year, as AI hype sent NVIDIA soaring, those options became worth over $7 million, a $5 million profit on a single trade. Tesla call options purchased before EV tax credit expansions. Microsoft purchases before major government cloud contracts. Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, all purchased at suspiciously opportune moments. Johnson gathered the trading documents. Grant Cardone, the entrepreneur, calculated that for you to accumulate your wealth on a congressional salary, you would need to be, and I quote, 33,000 years old. He later revised that to 300 years, assuming you never spent a penny. He looked at Pelosi. You're not 300 years old, Mrs. Pelosi, so either your husband is the greatest investor in the history of financial markets, better than Buffett, better than Soros, better than every hedge fund manager on Wall Street, or he has access to information that other investors don't have. Johnson set down the folder. There's a term for that. It's called insider trading. And while I'm not a prosecutor, and I'm not making legal accusations, I am asking a simple question. How does a family go from $2.7 million to $278 million while one spouse serves in Congress and the other trades stocks that are directly affected by legislation that spouse controls? He reached for the next folder. But let's move on. Let's talk about January 6th, since you brought it up. Johnson opened the second folder and pulled out a tablet. You attacked me for my role in questioning the 2020 election. Fair enough. I did sign on to legal challenges. I did vote against certifying certain states. We can debate whether that was right or wrong. But you suggested that I bear responsibility for what happened on January 6th, that I was part of an insurrection, that I encouraged violence. He looked at Pelosi. Let's talk about who actually bears responsibility for the security failures that day. Johnson tapped the tablet and a video began to play on the chamber's screens. It was footage from January 6, 2021, not the footage everyone had seen of the riot, but behind-the-scenes footage shot by Alexandra Pelosi, Nancy's daughter. In the video, Nancy Pelosi was being evacuated from the Capitol. She was on the phone, visibly agitated, speaking with her chief of staff. "We're calling the National Guard now," Pelosi said in the video. "They should have been here to start out." Johnson paused the video. "They should have been here to start out. Your words, Mrs. Pelosi. On January 6th, as the Capitol was being breached, you were asking why the National Guard wasn't already there." He resumed the video. "How many times did members ask, 'Are we prepared? Are we prepared?'" Pelosi continued in the footage. "We're not prepared for the worst." Johnson paused again. "We're not prepared. You knew it. You said it. On camera." He resumed the video one more time. "We have totally failed," Pelosi said. "We have to take some responsibility for not holding the security accountable." "We have to take some responsibility," Johnson repeated. And then, this is the key part. In the video, Pelosi's voice was clear. "I take responsibility." Johnson stopped the video. "I take responsibility. Those are your words, Mrs. Pelosi." On January 6, 2021, as the Capitol was under attack, you admitted on camera that you bore responsibility for the security failures. He set down the tablet. But here's what happened next. Instead of taking responsibility publicly, you spent the next 2 years and $20 million of taxpayer money creating a select committee to blame President Trump. Johnson pulled out more documents. When Minority Leader McCarthy nominated members to serve on that committee, you rejected 2 of his 5 picks, Jim Jordan and Jim Banks. You said their statements and actions disqualified them. What you meant was that they might ask uncomfortable questions, questions about your role, questions about the security decisions made by your office. Instead, you appointed Liz Cheney, who was already openly hostile to President Trump. You stacked the committee with members who had predetermined the outcome, and you conducted an investigation designed to produce a political result, not find the truth. Here Johnson held up another document. Capitol Police Chief Steven Sund has stated publicly that on January 3rd, 3 days before the attack, he requested National Guard support. He says your sergeant-at-arms denied that request. Under federal law, the Chief of Capitol Police cannot call in the National Guard without approval from the Capitol Police Board, which includes the House Sergeant-at-Arms who reports to you. Chief Sund says he was forced to decline an offer of National Guard support from the Pentagon because he didn't have authorization that could have come from your office. Johnson looked at Pelosi. You controlled House security as Speaker. You had the power to authorize National Guard deployment. According to the Capitol Police Chief, that authorization was denied. And then, after 4 Americans died and hundreds were injured after the Capitol was breached and the certification was delayed, you spent $20 million to blame someone else. He gathered the January 6th documents. You attacked me for signing a legal brief. You said I bear responsibility for the insurrection. But there's video of you admitting responsibility for the security failures. There's testimony from the Capitol Police Chief that your office denied his requests for support. There's evidence that your committee suppressed footage that contradicted your narrative. Who really bears responsibility for January 6th, Mrs. Pelosi? The people who filed lawsuits, or the person who controlled Capitol security and then spent millions covering it up? He reached for the next folder. But let's move on. Let's talk about your record of service to your district. Johnson opened the 3rd folder with a heaviness that filled the chamber. You've represented San Francisco for 37 years, Mrs. Pelosi. You've told us about your experience, your accomplishments, your decades of service. So let's examine what 37 years of Nancy Pelosi's leadership has produced for the people who elected her. He held up a photograph, a street in San Francisco lined with tents, trash scattered everywhere, people slumped against walls. This is the Tenderloin District in San Francisco. Not a third world country. Not a war zone. Your district. The community you've represented for nearly 4 decades. Johnson pulled out statistics. According to the most recent count, San Francisco has approximately 17,500 homeless people. That's one of the highest per capita rates in the nation. For a city of fewer than 900,000 people, That means roughly 1 in 50 residents is homeless. He held up another document. NBC Bay Area conducted an investigation of downtown San Francisco. They surveyed 153 blocks. Do you know what they found? He read from the report. Trash on every single block. 41 blocks with discarded hypodermic needles. 96 blocks with human feces. 96 blocks, Mrs. Pelosi. More than 60% of downtown San Francisco had human waste on the streets. Johnson looked up. A preschool teacher interviewed for that report said, and I quote, "We see poop, we see pee, we see needles, and we see trash." That's what she tells her students to watch out for on their way to school. In your district, after 37 years of your representation. He pulled out more data. San Francisco's drug crisis has become a national scandal. Fentanyl has turned parts of your city into open-air drug markets. Last year, federal workers at the Nancy Pelosi Federal Building, the building named after you, were told to work from home because it wasn't safe to come to the office. Drug dealers and users gather outside every day. Let me repeat that federal employees cannot safely go to the building that bears your name because of the drug crisis you've failed to address for decades. Johnson spread photographs across his podium images of tent encampments of drug use in plain sight of streets that looked like something from a dystopian film. San Francisco spends over $364 million per year on homelessness. The problem keeps getting worse. The city has some of the highest rents in America, $4,650 per month for a two-bedroom apartment. And yet, it also has some of the worst quality of life indicators in the country. How is that possible? How does one of the richest cities in the world, represented by one of the most powerful politicians in America, end up looking like this? Johnson set down the photographs. I'll tell you how. Because for 37 years, you've prioritized everything except the people who live in your district. You've been focused on national politics, on accumulating power, on becoming speaker. You've been focused on your stock portfolio and your ice cream and your hair appointments. And while you were focused on all of that, San Francisco fell apart. He pulled out one more document. Your net worth in 1987, $2.7 million. Your net worth today, $278 million. San Francisco's homeless population in 1987, approximately 5,000. San Francisco's homeless population today, 17,500. You got richer. Your district got worse. That's the math of your 37 years of service. Johnson looked at Pelosi. You lectured me about what I've accomplished in 8 years. What have you accomplished for San Francisco? In 37 drug markets operate openly. Businesses are fleeing. Families are leaving. Crime is soaring. And you're worth $278 million. That's not public service, Mrs. Pelosi. That's self-service. And the people of San Francisco have paid the price for your neglect while you counted your stock gains. He reached for the next folder. But let's continue. Let's talk about the rules you imposed on everyone else and exempted yourself from. Johnson opened the fourth folder slowly, letting the tension build. During the COVID-19 pandemic, you were one of the most vocal advocates for strict measures. Masks, lockdowns, business closures, social distancing. You supported policies that prevented Americans from visiting dying relatives in hospitals. You backed measures that shuttered small businesses and put millions out of work. You endorsed rules that kept children out of schools for over a year. He pulled out a stack of documents. These are some of the statements you made during that period. Let me read a few. Johnson read aloud, We must all follow the science. The science says masks work. The science says we need to stay home. Anyone who defies these rules is putting others at risk. He set down that document and picked up another. This is not about politics. This is about life and death. Anyone who refuses to follow the guidelines is selfish and irresponsible. And another, we will get through this together, but only if we all make sacrifices. No one is above the rules. No one gets special treatment. Johnson looked up at Pelosi. No one is above the rules. No one gets special treatment. Those were your words, Mrs. Pelosi. Do you remember saying them? Pelosi's jaw was tight. I stand by my support for public health measures. I'm not asking about public health measures. I'm asking about whether you followed them yourself. Johnson pulled out a photograph. September 1st, 2000. You walked into E-Salon, a hair salon in San Francisco. This was during a period when hair salons were ordered closed in your city. Indoor personal services were banned. Ordinary citizens couldn't get their hair done because of the rules you supported. He held up the photograph. It showed Pelosi inside the salon, no mask in sight, getting her hair styled. You weren't wearing a mask. Hair salons were closed. And there you were getting a blowout, while the rest of California was told to stay home. Johnson pulled out news reports documenting the incident. The salon owner released this footage because she was frustrated. Small business owners like her were being destroyed by the lockdowns. They couldn't pay their rent. They were losing everything they had built. And then, the most powerful woman in Congress, one of the loudest voices demanding compliance with these rules, walked in and demanded service. When the video surfaced, you had options. You could have apologized sincerely. You could have acknowledged that you made a mistake. You could have shown some humility and admitted that you had failed to practice what you preached. Johnson held up Pelosi's response. Instead, you said, and I quote, I take responsibility for trusting the word of a neighborhood salon that I've been to over the years many times, and that when they said we're able to accommodate people one person at a time, and that we could set up that time, I trusted that. As it turns out, it was a setup. He looked at her. A setup. The salon owner struggling to survive the lockdowns you supported was somehow responsible for you walking into her establishment maskless and demanding service. She set you up by letting you in when you asked. But it got worse. Your spokesman demanded that the salon owner apologize to you, not the other way around. You expected her to apologize for the crime of showing America that you don't follow your own rules. Johnson set down the documents. Erica Quios was that salon owner's name. She had to close her business, not because of the lockdowns, she was already dealing with those. She had to close because of the harassment she received after exposing you. Death threats, vandalism. Her business destroyed because she had the audacity to show that Nancy Pelosi doesn't follow the rules Nancy Pelosi demands everyone else follow. He pulled out another image, a screenshot from a television interview showing Pelosi in her home. Around the same time, you gave an interview from your San Francisco home. Behind you, visible on camera, was a $24,000 refrigerator, a Sub-Zero, state-of-the-art, the kind of appliance most Americans can't even dream of affording. And you showed off what was inside gourmet ice cream, expensive chocolate, luxury treats. While Americans were losing their jobs lining up at food banks, struggling to feed their families, you showed them your $24,000 refrigerator full of premium ice cream. Johnson let that image sit on the screens. The Marie Antoinette comparisons were inevitable. Let them eat cake became Let them eat ice cream. And just like Marie Antoinette, you seemed completely oblivious to how it looked, completely disconnected from the suffering of ordinary people, completely insulated by your wealth from the consequences of the policies you supported. He gathered the COVID documents. This wasn't a one-time thing, Mrs. Pelosi. It's a pattern. Rules for everyone else. Exceptions for you. You supported mask mandates on airplanes and then flew without a mask when you thought cameras weren't watching. You demanded that Americans stay home to stop the spread and then attended events and fundraisers with your wealthy donors. You told working families they had to sacrifice and then showed off your luxury lifestyle on national television. Johnson looked at her. You know what the difference is between us, Mrs. Pelosi. I've never told the American people to do something I wasn't willing to do myself. I've never imposed rules on others and then exempted myself. I've never shown off my wealth while ordinary people were suffering. 37 years in Congress, and you never learned that basic lesson about leadership. That's the real measure of your experience. He reached for the final folder. Now, let's talk about the bigger picture. Let's talk about the pattern that connects all of this. Johnson opened the last folder and took a moment before speaking. Mrs. Pelosi, you've been in Congress for 37 years. You've held more power than almost anyone in the history of this institution. You've been 2 heartbeats from the presidency. You've shaped legislation, controlled committees, and influenced the direction of American politics for a generation. He laid out documents across his podium. And in those 37 years, a pattern has emerged. A pattern of using public office for private gain. A pattern of avoiding accountability while demanding it from others. A pattern of self-interest dressed up as public service. Johnson held up the first document. Your stock trades consistently anticipate legislation you help write. Your family goes from wealthy to ultra-wealthy, while your constituents struggle with homelessness and drug addiction. You impose rules during a pandemic and then break them yourself. You admit responsibility for security failures and then spend millions blaming someone else. There's a word for this pattern, Mrs. Pelosi. It's called corruption. Pelosi's voice cut in sharply. That's a serious accusation. It is. And I want to be clear. I'm not accusing you of breaking the law. I'm not a prosecutor. I can't prove that your husband's stock trades were based on inside information. I can't prove that you deliberately denied National Guard support on January 6th. I can't prove that you intentionally neglected your district. Johnson set down the documents. What I can prove, what the record shows, is that in 37 years you've accumulated $275 million more than your salary could explain. Your district has deteriorated while your wealth has multiplied. You've broken rules you imposed on others, and you've never not once taken genuine responsibility for any of it. You came here today to attack me, to question my fitness for office, to remind everyone that you're experienced and I'm not. He looked directly at her. So let's compare our records, side by side. Johnson pulled out a final sheet. Net worth when I entered Congress, among the lowest in the House. Net worth today, still among the lowest in the House. I haven't gotten rich in office. Mrs. Pelosi, I make the same salary as every other member, and I live on that salary. Stock trading, I don't trade individual stocks. My wife doesn't trade individual stocks. We don't have a family portfolio that mysteriously beats every hedge fund in America. My district working families, small businesses, communities that are growing and thriving, not perfect, but not covered in needles and human waste. Rules for myself, the same rules I support for everyone else. I haven't shown off my luxury refrigerator while Americans suffered. I haven't demanded that small business owners apologize to me for my own mistakes. Johnson set down the sheet. You've been in Congress 37 years. I've been here 8. But in those 8 years, I haven't used my position to enrich myself. I haven't watched my district collapse while I counted my stock gains. I haven't broken my own rules and then blamed others when I got caught. He straightened. You asked what qualifies me to sit in this chair. Here's what qualifies me. I believe that public service means serving the public, not yourself, not your portfolio, not your political ambitions, the public. You've spent 37 years demonstrating a different understanding of public service, an understanding that says power is for enriching yourself, that rules are for other people, that accountability is something you impose on your enemies and avoid for yourself. Johnson walked back toward the speaker's chair. You called me inexperienced, and maybe I am by your standards. I don't have experience making $275 million in suspicious stock trades. I don't have experience letting my district fall apart while I got rich. I don't have experience breaking rules and blaming others. But I'd rather be inexperienced in those things and honest than experienced in them and corrupt. He sat down in the speaker's chair. The American people watched 37 years of your kind of experience. The stock trades, the rules for thee, but not for me. The district falling apart while you prospered. And they decided they wanted something different. That's why I'm sitting here. That's why you're not. And that's why the bill bearing your name is going to pass, because the American people are done with politicians who use public office to enrich themselves. He looked at her one final time. You came here to destroy me, Mrs. Pelosi, to remind everyone that you're the experienced one and I'm the amateur. But all you've done is remind everyone why they don't trust career politicians anymore, why they don't believe that experience in Washington is something to be proud of, why they wanted someone different. Johnson picked up his gavel. Thank you for your testimony. This hearing is adjourned. The chamber sat in stunned silence. For perhaps the first time in her 40-year political career, Nancy Pelosi had been comprehensively, methodically dismantled, not by partisan attacks or unfair characterizations, but by her own record documented and presented with devastating precision. She sat motionless at the witness table. The color had drained from her face. Her hands, usually animated when she spoke, lay flat on the table. Around her, staffers whispered urgently, but she didn't seem to hear them. The Democratic members who had been nodding approvingly during her attack now stared at their phones, at their papers, at anything except the witness table. There was nothing to say. No spin that could undo what had just happened. In the gallery, someone started a slow clap. It spread quickly to the Republican side of the chamber. Within moments, the applause was thunderous. Chairman of the House Administration Committee moved to formally adjourn, but his words were lost in the noise. Members were already rising from their seats, some moving toward the exits, others clustered in small groups processing what they had witnessed. Pelosi rose slowly from the witness table. Her staff formed a protective circle around her as she moved toward the door. Reporters shouted questions from the gallery. Mrs. Pelosi, do you have a response? Mrs. Pelosi, how do you explain the stock trades? Mrs. Pelosi, will you support the Pelosi Act now? She said nothing. She kept walking, her eyes fixed on some middle distance, her famous composure shattered. As she passed the speaker's chair, Johnson was calmly organizing his folders, speaking quietly with an aide. He looked up as she passed. Their eyes met for just a moment. Johnson nodded once, not triumphantly, but with something that might have been sympathy. Pelosi looked away and kept walking. She didn't stop until she was in her car, surrounded by tinted windows, away from the cameras that had captured every moment of her humiliation. Only then did she allow herself to understand what had happened. For 37 years, she had believed she was untouchable, too powerful, too experienced, too important. Every challenge had been overcome. Every scandal had been survived. Every accusation had been deflected or ignored. But the documentation had always been there. The stock trades, the January 6th footage, the San Francisco statistics, the COVID hypocrisy, waiting for someone willing to compile it, organize it, and present it without fear of the Pelosi machine. Mike Johnson hadn't been afraid. He had prepared methodically, waited patiently, and struck devastatingly. And now her legacy, the most powerful woman in congressional history, the master legislator, the queen of the House, lay in ruins. The video went viral within hours, 100 million views in the first 48 hours. Clips spread across every platform. The Queen dethroned became the top trending topic in the United States, then globally. The political fallout was swift and severe. Within a week, the Department of Justice announced it was reviewing the Pelosi family's stock trading records for potential violations of federal securities laws. The SEC opened its own inquiry. State attorneys general in multiple jurisdictions indicated they were monitoring the situation. The Pelosi Act passed the House with overwhelming bipartisan support, including votes from dozens of Democrats who had previously opposed it. The Senate followed suit within weeks. President Trump signed it into law at a ceremony where he pointedly thanked the member of Congress who inspired this legislation, even if she didn't mean to. Nancy Pelosi announced her retirement from Congress 3 weeks after the hearing. She released a statement expressing pride in her decades of service and gratitude to her constituents. She made no mention of the hearing or the accusations. She simply said it was time for a new generation to lead. The statement fooled no one. Within Democratic circles, the recriminations began immediately. Why had she attacked Johnson so aggressively? Why had she given him an opening to respond? Why hadn't someone warned her about the documentation he had compiled? The answers didn't matter. The damage was done. Pelosi retreated to her San Francisco home, the mansion that had become a symbol of her accumulated wealth. Occasionally, photographers would capture her walking in Pacific Heights, surrounded by security looking smaller than she had in the chamber. The aura of power that had surrounded her for decades had evaporated. Her allies distanced themselves. The phone calls that had once come hourly now came weekly, then monthly, then not at all. The invitations dried up. The media requests stopped. She had been the queen of the House. Now she was just another former politician, her legacy defined not by the legislation she had passed. The broader political implications of the hearing rippled through Washington for years. For congressional stock trading, the hearing was a watershed moment. The Pelosi Act, once considered unlikely to pass, became law within months. Both parties found it impossible to oppose the political cost of defending congressional stock trading after Johnson's presentation was simply too high. The law required all members of Congress, their spouses, and their dependent children to divest from individual stocks within 180 days or place their holdings in blind trusts. Violations would result in fines equal to the profits made, plus additional penalties. The SEC was given explicit authority to investigate trading by members of Congress. For Nancy Pelosi specifically, the law meant the end of the family's trading operation. Paul Pelosi had to sell or transfer hundreds of millions of dollars in stock holdings. The trades that had made the family wealthy for decades were no longer possible. It's ironic, one financial analyst noted on cable news. The bill named after her, the one designed to embarrass her, actually ended up costing her family more than anyone else. They had the most to lose from a stock trading ban, and now it's law. For the Democratic Party, the hearing accelerated a generational shift that had been building for years. The old guard, Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, Jim Clyburn, had dominated party leadership for decades, but the hearing revealed the costs of that dominance, the disconnect from ordinary voters, the appearance of self-dealing, the sense that the party had become a vehicle for personal enrichment rather than public service. New leaders emerged. Younger members who had been waiting in the wings suddenly found opportunities opening up. The party began to look different, more diverse, more connected to working-class concerns, more willing to criticize its own members for ethical lapses. Pelosi's fall cleared the path, one Democratic strategist explained. For years, nobody could challenge her. She controlled the money, the endorsements, the committee assignments. After the hearing, all of that power evaporated, and suddenly there was room for new voices. For Republicans, the hearing provided something they had sought for years, proof that their criticisms of Democratic elites weren't just partisan attacks. The stock trading data, the San Francisco statistics, the COVID hypocrisy, all of it was documented, verified, and presented by a speaker who had done his homework. Mike Johnson's standing within the party soared. The amateur who had stumbled into the speakership was now seen as a skilled political operator who had outmaneuvered one of the shrewdest politicians of her generation. His fundraising numbers exploded. His approval ratings climbed. Republican candidates across the country sought his endorsement. "He showed us how to do it," one Republican congressman said. "Don't attack with rhetoric. Attack with documentation. Let the facts speak for themselves." That's the lesson of the Pelosi hearing. For ordinary Americans, the hearing reinforced a growing conviction that the political class was fundamentally corrupt. The $278 million net worth, the suspicious stock trades, the maskless salon visit, all of it confirmed what many had suspected for years, that politicians play by different rules than everyone else. But the hearing also offered something unusual: accountability. A powerful politician had been confronted with her record and found wanting. It wasn't a prosecution or a conviction, but it was something. It was proof that the documentation existed, that someone was willing to use it, and that even the most powerful figures in Washington couldn't escape their own records forever. That sense of accountability, however incomplete, proved to be the hearing's most lasting legacy. 6 months after the hearing, a documentary about the confrontation aired on a major streaming service. Titled "The Queen Dethroned," it featured interviews with participants from both sides, analysis from political scientists, and previously unseen footage from the day itself. The documentary revealed details that hadn't been public before. It showed Johnson's preparation room the morning of the hearing, the folders arranged meticulously, the staff reviewing final documentation, the speaker calm and focused, while everyone around him was nervous. He knew exactly what she was going to do, his chief of staff said in an interview. He had sources inside the Democratic caucus. He knew she was planning to attack him personally, and he decided to let her. The documentary showed Pelosi's preparation room as well, the confidence, the rehearsed lines, the certainty that she was about to put the amateur in his place. "She underestimated him," a former Pelosi aide said anonymously. She saw a religious conservative from Louisiana who had been in Congress for 8 years. She didn't see a constitutional lawyer who had spent months preparing to take her apart. The filmmakers interviewed financial analysts who had studied the Pelosi family's trading patterns. "The statistical probability of achieving those returns through luck alone is essentially zero," one analyst explained. You'd have better odds winning the lottery multiple times. Either Paul Pelosi is the greatest investor in human history, better than Buffett, better than Soros, better than anyone who's ever traded stocks, or he had access to information that other investors didn't have. We can't prove insider trading, another analyst added, but we can prove that the patterns are extraordinary, and the timing relative to legislation is suspicious enough that any reasonable person would have questions. The documentary also featured interviews with San Francisco residents, people who had lived in Pelosi's district for decades and watched it deteriorate. "She stopped caring about us a long time ago," one longtime resident said. "She was too busy with national politics, with being speaker, with whatever was going on with her stocks. We were just the people who voted for her every 2 years. She never did anything for us." "I voted for her my whole life," another said. "My parents voted for her. My grandparents voted for her. And what do we have to show for it? Needles on the streets, homeless people everywhere, crime, drugs, a city that's falling apart." The documentary concluded with Johnson's reflection on what had happened. "She thought her experience made her untouchable," he said. 37 years in Congress, 8 years as Speaker, the most powerful woman in American political history. She thought no one would dare challenge her." He paused. "But experience in corruption isn't a qualification. It's an indictment. And eventually someone was going to present the evidence." The interviewer asked if he had any regrets. "I regret that it came to this," Johnson said. "I didn't want to destroy her. I didn't go into that hearing looking for a confrontation. I had the documentation prepared as a defensive measure in case she attacked me personally. But she did attack me. She called me an amateur, an extremist, a puppet. She questioned my faith, my integrity, my fitness for office. And when she did that, she gave me permission to respond." He shook his head. "I showed her the same courtesy she showed me. I presented facts about her record. I asked questions about her stock trades, her security failures, her district. I didn't invent anything. I didn't exaggerate. I just compiled what was already in the public record. The facts destroyed her, not me. The facts." The documentary ended with footage of the final moments of the hearing. Pelosi rising from the witness table, walking toward the exit, in silence, her career in ruins. Then it cut to Johnson calmly organizing his papers, preparing for the next item of business. The screen faded to black. Text appeared. Nancy Pelosi announced her retirement from Congress 3 weeks after the hearing. The Pelosi Act became law 2 months later. Speaker Mike Johnson continues to serve in his position. In the months that followed, the hearing became a symbol of something larger than one politician's downfall. For Americans who had grown cynical about government, it was proof that accountability was still possible, that powerful people could still face consequences, that the documentation existed waiting for someone willing to use it. For career politicians in both parties, it was a warning. The old rules, the assumption that seniority and power provided protection, no longer applied. The same transparency that allowed citizens to track congressional stock trades could also expose patterns of self-dealing. The same cameras that broadcast hearings could capture moments of devastating accountability. For Mike Johnson, the hearing transformed his image. The unknown speaker, who had stumbled into the position through Republican infighting, was now seen as something else entirely, a leader willing to stand up to the most powerful figures in Washington, armed with nothing but documentation and the courage to use it. His approval ratings soared. Donations flooded into Republican campaigns. The amateur had become the man who dethroned the Queen. And for Nancy Pelosi, the hearing marked the end of everything she had built. She lived quietly now, rarely appearing in public, her political network dissolved, her legacy redefined. The legislation she had passed, the Affordable Care Act, the financial reforms, the stimulus packages, was still on the books. But when people thought of Nancy Pelosi, they no longer thought of those accomplishments. They thought of the hearing, the stock trades, the $278 million, the San Francisco streets covered in needles and waste, the maskless hair salon visit, the $24,000 freezer full of gourmet ice cream. They thought of the moment when Mike Johnson, the amateur from Louisiana, had presented 37 years of documentation and asked simple questions she couldn't answer. They thought of the Queen dethroned. 1 year after the hearing, Johnson gave a speech at a town hall in Shreveport. A young woman in the audience raised her hand. "Mr. Speaker, do you ever think about that hearing? About Mrs. Pelosi?" Johnson considered the question. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "Not with satisfaction, not with pride, but with a kind of sadness." He explained, "Nancy Pelosi could have been different. She was smart. She was capable. She had opportunities to accomplish real things for real people. And to her credit, she did accomplish some things legislation that helped millions of Americans. But somewhere along the way, she forgot why she was there. She started seeing public office as an opportunity for personal enrichment. She started treating the rules as things that applied to others, not to her. She started believing that her power made her untouchable. And when you believe you're untouchable, you get careless. You make trades that look suspicious. You break your own rules and expect no consequences. You let your district fall apart while you get rich." Johnson shook his head. That hearing didn't destroy Nancy Pelosi. She destroyed herself over 37 years, one decision at a time. "I just presented the documentation." He looked out at the audience. "The lesson isn't about Nancy Pelosi. The lesson is about what power does to people who forget why they have it. The lesson is that public service means serving the public, not yourself. The lesson is that if you use your position to enrich yourself while the people you represent suffer, eventually someone will notice. Eventually, someone will ask questions. Eventually, someone will hold you accountable. That's what I believe. That's what I've always believed. And that's what I'll keep believing for as long as I hold this office." He paused. "Some people get elected to Congress and see it as an opportunity to get rich. I see it as an opportunity to serve, and I hope, I pray that I never forget the difference." The applause was long and loud. In the back of the room, a reporter scribbled in her notebook, "The Queen is dead. Long live the Speaker." In San Francisco, things began to change. Pelosi's retirement opened the door for new leadership politicians who had grown up watching her dominance and learning from her mistakes. The new representative for the district was a young progressive who had made ethics reform a centerpiece of her campaign. She didn't trade stocks. She didn't live in a mansion. She spent her weekends walking through the Tenderloin, talking to homeless people and drug addicts, trying to understand problems that had been ignored for decades. It wasn't magic. The problems didn't disappear overnight. But for the first time in years, there was a sense that someone was paying attention, that the representative actually cared about the district, not just about accumulating power in Washington. The drug markets were pushed back. The tent encampments were addressed with a combination of enforcement and services. The streets got cleaner. The crime rates started to drop. It would take years to undo the damage of decades of neglect. But the trajectory had changed. And when people asked what had sparked the change, the answer was always the same: the hearing. The moment when Mike Johnson had laid out 37 years of documentation and asked a simple question, "What have you accomplished for San Francisco?" The question had no good answer. And from that absence of answers Change had finally become possible. In her Pacific Heights mansion, Nancy Pelosi watched the news of San Francisco's gradual improvement with something she rarely felt regret. She had told herself for years that she was serving her constituents, that her power in Washington translated into benefits for San Francisco, that the homeless and the drug addicts and the crime were problems beyond any one politician's ability to solve. But the new representative was solving them, not completely, not perfectly, but meaningfully. She was doing what Nancy Pelosi had stopped doing decades ago. She was paying attention to the people who had elected her. Nancy had stopped paying attention somewhere around the 100th million in her portfolio. Around the time she became Speaker the first time. Around the time she started to believe that her power made her untouchable. And now she was touched. Touched by a first-term congressman from Louisiana who had simply read the documentation and asked questions. She thought about calling him sometimes, apologizing maybe, acknowledging that he had been right about some things. But she never did. Pride, perhaps, or shame, or simply the inability to admit after 37 years that she had lost her way. Instead, she sat in her mansion, surrounded by the wealth she had accumulated, and watched a new generation try to fix the problems she had ignored. The Queen was dethroned. The kingdom was in new hands. And the documentation, the stock trades, the January 6th footage, the San Francisco statistics remained in the public record, a permanent reminder of what happens when public servants forget who they serve. The hearing changed something fundamental in American politics. Before that day, there had been an unspoken assumption that certain figures were untouchable, that decades of accumulated power created a kind of immunity, that challenging the establishment was futile because the establishment would always protect its own. Mike Johnson shattered that assumption. He had done it not with rhetoric or partisan attacks, but with documentation, with facts, with the kind of methodical preparation that turned accusations into evidence and questions into indictments. The message was clear. No one was untouchable anymore. No amount of power, no length of tenure, no accumulation of allies could protect a politician from their own documented record. The information was out there in financial disclosures, in video archives, in public records. All it took was someone willing to compile it and present it. After the hearing, members of Congress became noticeably more careful. Stock trading dropped dramatically, even before the Pelosi Act became law. Transparency increased. The most egregious examples of self-dealing became rarer. Some of this was genuine reform. Some of it was fear. But whatever the motivation, the behavior changed. And that change could be traced directly back to a single hearing where a speaker from Louisiana had shown that accountability was possible. Political consultants began teaching the Johnson method, the strategy of letting an opponent attack, documenting every accusation, and then responding with overwhelming evidence that turned each attack into a weapon against the attacker. It became standard practice in campaigns at every level. Don't respond immediately, consultants would advise. Let them commit. Let them say everything they want to say. And then present the documentation. Let their own words define what they're being held accountable for. The technique worked because it avoided the appearance of partisanship. Johnson hadn't attacked Pelosi out of nowhere. He had responded to her attacks on him. Every accusation she had made about his inexperience, his religion, his role in January 6th, had become an opening for him to present evidence about her record. It was political judo at its finest, using the opponent's momentum against them. Years later, historians would debate the significance of the hearing. Some argued it was a turning point, the moment when the post-World War II political establishment finally began to crack. The Pelosi hearing, they said, was the congressional equivalent of the fall of the Berlin Wall, a symbolic collapse that revealed deeper structural changes already underway. Others were more skeptical. Corruption hadn't ended, they pointed out. Self-dealing continued, just more carefully. The same forces that had enriched Pelosi would find new ways to enrich her successors. The hearing was theater, not transformation. But even the skeptics acknowledged that something had changed. A line had been crossed. A precedent had been set. And the name Pelosi, once synonymous with power and success, had become synonymous with something else entirely. Pulling a Pelosi entered the political lexicon. It meant getting caught doing exactly what you had condemned others for doing. It meant having your own record used against you. It meant the moment when decades of accumulated hypocrisy finally caught up with you. It wasn't a flattering legacy, but it was an accurate one. And in the end, accuracy was what the hearing had been about. Not partisan attacks, not personal vendettas, just the documented record presented clearly, and the simple question that had ended a 40-year career: where did the money come from? Nancy Pelosi had never answered that question, and her silence had said everything.